Welcome to another episode of Authors Reads. Today, I'm really pleased to have the author Eli Greenbaum of the book Hell No, We Didn't Go: First-Hand Accounts of Vietnam War Protest and Resistance. Welcome, Eli, and how's it going?
Oh, it's going just perfectly, Dan. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, tell me about this book.
This book is about what the guys back in the 1960s and 70s did, those guys who opposed the Vietnam War and did not want to participate in it. If they couldn't make the government not participate in it, they weren't going to participate in it at least. And what I did was gathered a lot of the firsthand accounts of these fellows who avoided the war, who found ways to avoid the draft, which was called conscription by its real name. It was not just simply drafting you like you would for the NFL or for basketball leagues or something like that. This was the draft where you were put into the military, into the army, later on into the Marines. And these fellows that I spoke with decided that they did not want to participate in that war, and they found ways to avoid it.
So, talk to me about you and how you came to write this book.
What brought me to the book, it's kind of interesting. My wife and I were visiting a friend in Pittsburgh. We're from Detroit, and we went to Pittsburgh. We were visiting one of my high school friends. And as older guys will sometimes do, we sat around at dinner, his wife, my wife, the four of us, and we started reminiscing about high school. And soon my friend and I were talking about, gee, what happened to this guy? What happened to that guy? And a couple of the guys went off to Vietnam and did not come back. And then we started talking about, well, how did we avoid the war? How did we avoid the draft? And we started reminiscing about it and naming other guys and what happened to them and wondering where did they go off to? Well, the next day on the drive back to Detroit, my wife, Barbara, who is in publishing and is very curious about a lot of things, said, you really haven't talked very much about that period of your life and the draft and what you were subject to. She said, what went on? Are there a lot of guys that you know that were trying to avoid the draft? And I said, well, yeah, when I start to think about it, so and so avoided it, and this guy and that guy. And she said, you ought to write a book about it. And I said, well, I don't know. And she said, yeah, yeah. She said, your generation went through a lot of stuff back in the 60s. There might be some very interesting stories that subsequent generations might want to know about. Well, by the time we got to Detroit, 4 or 5 hours later, she had me convinced. And I had convinced myself that there was a lot to tell about that time. And so I began to contact friends and I began to gather stories, asking people, are you willing to talk about this time? Are you willing to tell me what you did to avoid the draft, to avoid the war? And soon people started talking to me, a lot of people, and they had a lot to say.
Do you have a background in either writing or listening?
Background in both, actually. Um, I was an attorney for quite a few years, so I listened a lot and I talked a lot. And I was also in advertising for a number of years. And part of the work that I did in advertising and in law was interviewing people. And in interviewing people, I became a good listener and was able to pick out things that were important, pick out things that were significant. And I was able to encourage people to tell their stories and to tell me what mattered to them and how it mattered. Whether it was someone talking about a product that we were selling or somebody in an interrogatory, or I'm sorry, in a deposition talking about something that happened to them and we needed it for trial or for settlement purposes, I was able to get people to talk, and I was fortunately very able to get people to tell me a lot of what happened to them during the Vietnam War era.
Did you record these interviews digitally?
Some of them I did, and as requested by some people, destroyed them after I got what I needed, after the people consented to their stories being reproduced. We had agreements that I said I would not keep recordings of things. I would not reveal certain names. I stayed true to those agreements. I got the firsthand accounts that I wanted, and I was able to protect their identities in those cases of people who did not want to be identified. But I will say a lot of the people did not have any problem being identified, and in fact wanted the people to know, readers to know, what their opinions were.
Have the people you interviewed seen the book and have they given you feedback on?
Yes, the people that are in the book, and I would point out that I did, gosh, I interviewed more than 100 people. There are 46 people represented in the book. I think I got about 120 people in total. And there were dozens more that I could have interviewed that I simply had to cut off at some point. The people that I interviewed and that are in the book, no one, not a single person has come forth and said, you've misrepresented me, or I didn't say this, or anything of that kind. And most of them have, in fact, thanked me for being able to tell their story. I had one man, and this one really got me. He said, my granddaughter never understood what I went through. She said, after reading the book, she now understands what I went through, meaning him, and what his friends went through. He wound up in jail. He wound up in prison because he refused to be inducted. She thought he was a coward, but he wasn't. He was far from it. In fact, he was one of the men who made a very strong point about it. He said, I respect all the people that were in the service. Those men and women should not be disrespected. He said, but we should also respect the people who on principle refused to go into the military, refused to participate. That took a lot of courage.
Well, I think that makes a wonderful introduction for you, Ellie Greenbaum, to read from your book. Hell no, we didn't go. Firsthand accounts of Vietnam War protest and resistance. Ellie?
Thank you, Dan. Before I read it, I want to mention that while some individuals at that time more or less resigned themselves to the idea that they were going to be drafted and there wasn't much that they could do about it, others were determined to follow any path that was necessary to beat it. And sometimes this would require some kind of compromise with the ethical self. For example, how far would you go to avoid the draft? How far would you go to avoid being assigned some kind of military occupation? What price were you willing to pay? What were you willing to risk? And most importantly, what laws were you willing to break? For some, bending the laws was fully justified. I'd like to read an excerpt by a fellow we'll just call Al. His name is in the book, but I'm not going to read it on this podcast. Al is a retired biochemist. He's very much his own person, a man with a distinctive way of seeing the world. And he was not one to let the Selective Service make life decisions for him. No way was Al going to fight in Vietnam. No way was he going to be drafted. But if his draft board was going to bust his balls, he would bust theirs. As Al put it, this is Al speaking, I would have avoided military service under any circumstances. The Vietnam War was particularly awful from any point of view, ethical, philosophical, political, strategic, legal. The draft was universal, but the rules were arbitrary and contained many categories of individuals that could not be drafted. Students, heads of family, conscientious objectors, all had deferments or exemptions. I lost my student deferment in May of '67 When I graduated from the University of Michigan, I then received a letter from my draft board saying I was no longer a student and I was reclassified to 1A and had to report for a physical, which would determine whether I would actually be drafted. My vague backup plan was to move to Canada, but first I'd try to prove that I was unfit for military service. I knew people who had been rejected after doctors wrote letters documenting various medical problems, or psychiatrists who wrote letters saying they were nuts. But I decided to convince the military doctors myself. Going past the guardhouse at the entrance to Fort Wayne, the induction center in Detroit, was frightening. I had entered enemy territory. All morning, hundreds of scared young men like me, dressed only in their underwear, were herded to military doctors at stations devoted to one simple test or another. Blood pressure, turn your head and cough, say ah. Most of the morning was spent waiting in lines. The military knew how to make us feel scared and powerless, impotent. To my dismay, bad feet and an allergy to bee stings didn't impress the doctors. The next part of the exam was designed to identify recruits who were unsuitable because of subversive tendencies. I thought I'd be discovered. Organizations designated subversive were listed, followed by questions about involvement with these groups. To some questions, did you ever attend parties or other social gatherings with members of these organizations? I answered, I don't know. I was just trying to meet women and didn't ask about politics. My answers pissed off the large sergeant administering the test. He loudly observed that I was the only person in the room of about 200 people who had answered these questions incorrectly. Unfortunately, none of this disqualified me from the draft. Lastly, we filled out a form asking questions that probed our psychological fitness for military service. I admitted I took a lot of drugs and I checked all kinds of categories that might indicate psychological problems. My reward was to speak with a psychiatrist a few weeks later. Finally, an appointment, some progress. I was high on LSD when I drove back to Fort Wayne for my psychiatric appointment. In the interview with the shrink that lasted about 30 to 40 minutes, as proof of my incompatibility, I took a tablet of acid, LSD, out of my pocket, explained what it was, and swallowed it. The psychiatrist said he agreed I would be a bad influence on other soldiers. But that's why the Army built Briggs. It was clear to both of us who controlled that outcome, and I suspect he may have given me a deferral if my ego had allowed me to act more like I actually felt, a lot less defiant and much more scared. All that remained was to wait in a long line to turn in the forms that guaranteed I would be drafted. While I was standing there in line, stealing the forms suddenly seemed like a better option. The certainty of being drafted if I didn't steal them made my fear of being caught irrelevant. The bureaucracy had a record that I kept my appointment. They couldn't find my physical. They might assume it was just misplaced. In any case, the penalty for getting caught probably would be to be drafted. Catch-22 logic turned on the military itself. I put the forms under my heavy winter coat and walked off the base with my arms folded in front of me so the forms would not fall out. Nobody stopped me. I didn't hear from the draft board for about 6 months. Then I received a letter telling me I had to take another physical. No mention of the file I'd stolen. I waited a couple months to tell the draft board that I moved to San Francisco. By 1969, I was called for a physical in Emeryville, California. I used the same plan as the first physical, but some of the details changed. This time I didn't sleep for a couple days. I had a friend who was a former junkie put needle tracks on my arms. I showed up 3 hours late. I shouldn't have bothered with such puny attempts. It seemed like anyone who could walk in was in good enough shape to be drafted. But I was not going to. We had to hand in our form. to a security guard as we exited the door. I rolled mine into my jacket, looked for another way out of the building. There was no other choice. I had to walk past the guard. So I did. I walked out the front door, form tucked under my windbreaker. I waved at him. He didn't wave back, but he didn't try to stop me. That was the last interaction with my draft board. Al's adventure, as it turned out, he was very fortunate because I found out afterwards that the selective service system did not have at that time a central station of everybody's records. It was all done on a local draft board basis. So if something was missing from your local draft board, probably nobody in the central location in Washington had a copy of it. That, I don't know if that's actually true, but I was not able to find in my research anything about a central repository. I would also add that one gentleman that I interviewed told me that he was about to be inducted when he found out that his local draft board had burned down. Someone, an arsonist, had gotten to his local draft board. All records were gone. The draft board officials apparently put an ad in the paper a few days later asking anybody who was part of the draft board to come in and re-register or somehow give them the information needed to recreate the files. My understanding is that nobody responded to the ad.
Does that
So,
response surprise you?
no, it doesn't surprise me at all. When you think about it, I mean, you know something, Dan, a lot of the guys that did not want to go into the army, America was really split at that time. If you recall, it was the 60s, it was the wild 60s. We had civil rights issues going on. We had drug issues going on, urban riots. 1967 and 1968, you had love-ins and you had Woodstock at the same time that you had race riots in cities across the country. You had feminism rising. You had the creation of the birth control pill. You had Bob Dylan, songs of protest. You had Pete Seeger. You had schisms in our society. And so suddenly a generation, my generation, that had been complacent through the Eisenhower years, suddenly things were beginning to affect us directly. And we discovered we had a voice. And a lot of the people that did not want to go into the military were opposed to war in general, opposed to the Vietnam War, and opposed to getting shot or killed in battle. This was also the time of America, love it or leave it. If you did not agree with going into the military, if you were not complacent and just simply accepted the fact that you were going to be drafted, then you were a traitor by some people, or you were a coward. And in truth, yes, obviously there's cowards everywhere at every war, although the definition of coward we can argue about day and night. But a lot of the people that objected to the draft and did not want to be drafted were not cowards at all. They were people who stood their ground and basically said, I do not want to participate in this. This is not a righteous war. This is not a war that we should be involved in. And so these people took a stand. These people decided in many cases to leave the country. They went to Canada. And many Canadians sent thank you notes to the United States because this was perhaps the most productive wave of immigrants to ever enter Canada, who in many cases were accompanied by wives and girlfriends. And so you had an influx in Canada of it's estimated from 20,000 to 100,000 people.
If I could, I'd like to narrow the focus a bit.
Sure, please.
You mentioned in the introduction to your book that you are not the first member of your family to face induction into a military.
Well, I come from a family of draft dodgers,
Okay.
someone might say. My father, you could call him a draft dodger. When he was 18 and living in a tiny village in Poland, he received his notice, and his family was extremely upset. He had two brothers who had left Poland and gone on to what is now Czechoslovakia and then on to Austria. They avoided the draft. They left before they were too young. And my father's father, my grandfather, and grandmother were beside themselves with the idea that their son would go into the Polish army. The problem was, and I'm going to bring up a delicate issue, but the problem was anti Semitism. Jews were not often welcome into the Polish army beyond being physically there and adding to the numbers of fighting men. But as my father told me, sometimes it was more dangerous to be Jewish in the barracks than it was to be on the battlefield. So my father's father worked out a situation where he bribed a doctor to give my father a failing grade in the physical. But at the last minute, the doctor was switched out with another doctor. And the new doctor, when my father said the code that I have a heart problem, the new doctor said, "No, you don't. You're fine. You're strong. You're going to make a great soldier." My father went home, told his parents he would have to go into the army, and packed his bags and left for what is now Czechoslovakia the next day. He did not get drafted. He eventually made his way to what was then Palestine, which is now Israel, and then from there to the United States in 1951. My father was not a coward. He fought in Israel. He held his ground in Detroit in several episodes that required physical confrontation. He's never ducked out of battle, but, and this is where he said, some things are unnecessary, and sometimes you do not need to fight. And when you don't need to fight, you can walk away and not compromise your principles. And that's what he taught me. He also taught me that when you're looking at big, tough decisions like this, and when you're reading the news or hearing people talking about making warlike sounds, it's time to ask questions. It's time to look behind that. And so I was one of those people who protested and looked at what was going on and took the unpopular stand that something is going on that just doesn't involve us. Why are we there? Why are we in Vietnam? And we could not understand it. So I stood with other people in that area. Is that, I hope, give you some of what you wanted to?
Yes, very much so. Thank you. My other question is about college deferments, and were they widely available?
Um, that's a good question because I come from a middle class background. My parents were shop owners. They were merchants. Most of my friends, I went to a high school. 80% of our graduating class went on to college, I think. And I know that most of the guys that I know were in the professions, but most of the people that I interviewed and spoke with were a cross section of society. And what it was what we held in common was the belief that I explained earlier that you ask questions, you find out what you're doing. And we did not believe that what was going on in Vietnam was worth putting ourselves in jeopardy at the whims of a government and a selective service system that was not fair, that did not have the interests of its population at heart, we believed, and did not really have the interests of most Americans at heart. This was not a popular view in the beginning. This was not a commonly accepted view. The majority of Americans coming out of the Eisenhower administration felt that you went along with what the government said and did. But here I am with my educated friends, with people who went to college, with people who asked questions and said, wait a minute, why are we doing this? What's in it for us? Why are you interrupting our careers? Why are you disrupting our lives? But on the other hand, I have to say that a lot of people viewed the military as a righteous career alternative as a valuable asset and a valuable option. And I agree with that because for many people, the military, first of all, I respect the military. I think the people that are in there deserve to be applauded for the service that they have performed. The men and women there are brave, loyal Americans, and to disrespect them is unfair and uncalled for. But not everybody is bound to the military. Not everybody is cut out for the military. And so there are differences. The military was absolutely right for many people, giving them career options, giving them educational opportunities, training them for valuable lifelong skills. And so I applaud that. One of the other things that I'd like to point out is that in this book, even though it's put out by an academic press, it is not a scholarly book. It is designed to provide information about the resistance to the draft. But in order to provide that, we have to look at history. And so there is history in the book in the sense of providing context for the reader so the reader can understand, especially younger generations that may have not lived through the 60s and 70s and only heard about it through relatives or through books of what went on. My generation was the last one to be drafted. There hasn't been a draft since then. Kids in school today do not have to worry about the draft.
Can I say that I read the book itself and the apparatus you provided around each interview contextualize it and helps give the reader a sense of how it felt to be subject to the draft in the 60s and 70s.
Well, Dan, the problem for most of us at that time who were vulnerable to the draft is that we knew that it could come at us and turn our life upside down. So consequently, as long as you were exposed to it, it was always on your mind, at least for the men that I spoke with. And because of that, they adjusted their lives to do different things to somehow prevent being inducted into the Army. I spoke to an attorney who represented a lot of people, and he said the frustrating thing was, even though he never lost a single client to the draft, he would save 10 people from the military, but another 10 would go in. And he told me of one story where he represented a man before a conservative judge in Detroit federal court. And the judge listened to one man's plea as to why he refused to be inducted. And after the man presented his case, the judge looked at the man, and this is a very conservative judge, reputation. He was appointed by Nixon. And he said, "You know, I find you guilty. You did refuse to be inducted, and you are guilty of that felony. However, I am going to sentence you and give you a choice. You may either go to prison for 2 years, you may enlist in the military voluntarily, or you can write 2 book reports." And the man just kind of looked at him and said, "What?" And he said, 2 book reports. You can write a book report about The Winds of War by Herman Wouk and The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam. And the man kind of in disbelief said, "I'll write the book reports." And that was said to a stunned courtroom that could not believe the judge presented that sentence alternative. The attorney told me he'd never heard any such thing before. So you have a lot of very strange things going on during the war as the population began to move away from our involvement and courts began to take positions, opening up the definition of a conscientious objector, where once you needed to have a certain religion, after a while, you did not even need a belief in a supreme being to qualify as a conscientious objector.
Now, here I am putting on my librarian hat and say I'm really impressed that this book got published by the University of Kansas, an academic publisher. Can you tell me about how the university press was involved in the making of this book?
When I sent a proposal to the University of Kansas Press, officially called University Press of Kansas, I sent actually an email to the acquisitions editor there and told her what I had, what I was writing. And I got an email back within 24 hours saying, tell me more. As it turned out, the University Press of Kansas specializes in American history and war studies. And they have a series of books about the Vietnam War. But nobody had submitted a proposal to them about men who would try to avoid the Vietnam War. And so they were interested in this, let's say, counter view, an opposing view to put on the shelves with their military books. They were very interested. They asked me a lot of questions. They put me through the paces. I had 4 peer reviews. And before the book went into publication, they had it checked by a Vietnam War expert to ensure that everything was accurate. And it came back with thumbs up, shall we say. And they said, we're going to go ahead and put this out there. And I thought they should be commended for taking what could be a very unpopular topic and putting it on the shelf with their other military history books. They, I believe, were trying to display academic responsibility, scholarly responsibility to show that there is more than one viewpoint.
I'm sort of running out of words here, but before I say goodbye, are there any other points or stories that you haven't mentioned that you'd like to make before we say goodbye?
Yes, I would like to point a couple things out, and I'll try to make it brief. Women participated too. This isn't all about men. Not only did women accompany men to protests when their boyfriends or husbands or brothers or sons were protesting, women took the initiative in many cases. There was a group of women known as Women Against Daddy Warbucks who invaded New York City draft offices, went in and destroyed files. They turned draft files into confetti. They also broke typewriters and destroyed the keys on typewriters, particularly the number 1 and the letter A, because draft boards were assigning the draft classification of 1A to men, the most vulnerable classification. These women went in, turned files into confetti. They were arrested, and they were never tried or convicted because nobody would testify. They also were not given certain constitutional protections. Women were arrested, well-known women participated. Feminism on the rise. I would also point out, and I can say this in closing, one of the men that was drafted, that refused induction, was the man that I mentioned earlier, whose granddaughter never understood why he went to prison, thought he was a coward. He was beaten up. He was attacked sexually by another man in prison. And when he went to the infirmary with all kinds of injuries, the doctor treating him said, your pain is caused by the beating, but you're the draft dodger, aren't you? They put him in restraints, and the doctor told the nurse, no painkillers for 24 hours. And so this is the punishment that the man got because he was a draft dodger. These things happened almost routinely. I will end now, and I will end it on an anecdote which will explain why I think this book is important and why it should be out there. The next generation is not familiar with the draft. One of the men in the book is a professor at a university in San Diego, and he teaches about the Vietnam War, teaches history. And in a recent class, I got this too late to put in the book. A 21-year-old student came up to him after the professor had lectured about the war. And he said to the professor, "Do you mean to tell me that back in the 60s, while this war was on, that the draft board, the government could come at me, could assign me a classification of 1A, could draft me, could put me in uniform, could send me to Vietnam, and could put me on the battlefield, and I could be killed, or I would have to kill someone else? Do you mean they could do that to me?" And the professor looked at him and said simply, "Yes." The student was stunned, and that was it. What today's generations don't understand is what this book is trying to communicate.
Well, thank you very much, Ellie. That was Eli Greenbaum and his book, Hell No, We Didn't Go, Firsthand Accounts of Vietnam War, Protest and Resistance. It's out now and it's a great book, and I think you should take a look at it. And with that, I conclude this episode of Author Reads. I've been your host, Dan McLaughlin, and if you have a question or comment you'd like me to pass along to Ellie, you can email me at djng@earthlink.net. If you've written something and you want to be on the podcast, you can email me at djng@earthlink.net. But that's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.